Hi everybody, this is John Gillespie, and this is my video presentation of The Rise of the Right for History 1302, in which we're going to be describing why a lot of Americans were dissatisfied with some of the changes that happened in the 1960s and 1970s, both socially, politically, and economically. And then we're going to describe why a lot of Americans turned to the right toward Ronald Reagan and participated in a conservative revolution. So let's get started. So let's take a look at why the 1970s were, well, kind of tough on America. On the one hand, there was the rights revolution, and I'm not saying this was a bad thing that we start to talk about expanding the democratic enterprise and participation in society to women and to gay Americans. But a lot of Americans found it unsettling. And so the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, gay rights movement, all challenged what many Americans considered to be traditional values and ideas. And it was, like I said, unsettling to many who would like to go and reverse the clock. There was also a lot of political scandal and corruption. The 1970s is perhaps best known for the release of the Pentagon Papers, revealing that the United States leadership had lied about our involvement in Vietnam. There was Watergate, revealing widespread corruption within the Nixon administration, the resignation of Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, Ford's pardon of Nixon, all contributed to what's called the credibility gap, or the mistrust of government. People began to believe in the 1970s that government was a force that was not acting in their best interests, but was acting in its own interests. Then there was the loss of Vietnam, the first time in many Americans' memory that we had lost a war. The Paris Peace Accords of 1973, which formally ended the Vietnam War, left South Vietnam vulnerable to the north, and of course, Saigon fell to the communist invaders in 1975. The United States had effectively lost a war, bringing on what was called the Vietnam Syndrome. Then there was the economic downturn, beginning with President Ford and affecting the presidency of President Carter. Runaway stagflation dragged the American economy down, which the GDP, the gross domestic product, was down, unemployment is up, corporate earnings are down, and inflation is up. This is a recipe that economists had never seen before and were unsure about what to do with it. Then there was the OPEC oil embargo of 1973-1974. It showed just how vulnerable American companies were to the whims of the petrolords in the Middle East, who decided that they were going to limit the amount of oil they were giving to any nation that supported Israel. Then there was the Iranian hostage crisis, showing the inability of the United States to rescue American hostages being held captive in Iran. And that, of course, damages American prestige and credibility around the world. And then there was Jimmy Carter. Now, I'm not going to beat up on Jimmy Carter. He was a very nice guy. He was generally honest and well-meaning, but a lot of political historians agree he was ill-equipped to face the challenges of his day and went down in history as not a very effective president, but a very good ex-president. And so, as we can see, a right-wing revolution was already brewing within the 1970s. And so, in order to trace the roots of this neoconservative or Republican revolution, we have to look at some of the things that happened within the 60s and in the 70s and then came to full force in the 1980s. And the first is Barry Goldwater. Now, Barry Goldwater was an unsuccessful presidential contender in 1964, running against the very popular Lyndon Johnson. Now, he offered a very hard right conservative social and economic program that America, well, just wasn't quite ready for in 1964. He offered to abolish the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, which would effectively end taxation. He also wanted to repeal the Civil Rights Act of 1964, not on racist grounds. He was not personally racist in his own views, but he felt it was an illegitimate use of government force to try to enforce good relations among the races. And then he also advocated a near total repeal of almost all social welfare programs, believing that it was an illegitimate function of government to support people, that people should assume personal responsibility and support themselves. And so Barry Goldwater, although he lost the election of 1964, he enters into history as the figurehead of a powerful coalition of neoconservatives in the 1960s and in the 1970s. He says, "Where is the politician who has not promised to fight to the death for lower taxes, and who has not proceeded to vote for the very spending projects that make tax cuts impossible?" Another person we're going to look to locate the roots of neoconservatism is Phyllis Schlafly. Phyllis Schlafly arose as an opponent, a very vocal and outspoken opponent of many liberal issues that she found to be objectionable. Now, she herself was a constitutional lawyer, and she first gained national attention when in 1960 she opposed the Republican presidential contender Nixon and his stand against segregation. And she successfully went on to rally opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment in 1972 that would recognize women as a protected class under the 14th Amendment, and she pushed to overturn Roe v. Wade, which was passed by the Supreme Court in 1973, which legalized some forms of abortion. And of course, as we know, she was not successful. Roe v. Wade is still the law of the land. She formed the Eagle Forum in 1972 and continued to fight against the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, same-sex marriage, pornography, and abortion. And she chaired this organization until her death, until 2016. She said, "What I am defending is the real rights of women. A woman should have the right to be in the home as a wife and mother." Another place we can locate the source of neoconservatism is in reaction against the Supreme Court of the 1950s and 1960s, known as the Warren Court, because they were led by Chief Justice Earl Warren. And they made some of the more progressive rulings in U.S. history, which you've probably heard of. There was Brown v. Board of Education, which outlawed segregation by race in public schools. There was Engel v. Vitale, which outlawed school prayer. Now, let's put an asterisk on that. People can still pray in school, but what is outlawed is mandated school prayer and school prayer that is led by state employees or district employees who are paid by tax dollars. Then there was Griswold v. Connecticut, which overturned the state's rights to regulate birth control on the grounds that this is a violation of a couple's privacy. And then there was Miranda v. Arizona, which mandated, you may have heard the so-called Miranda rights, that when somebody is arrested, they have to be read their rights so that they are aware of that they can have access to a lawyer, that they can remain silent. We've probably seen this on television quite enough. Well, a lot of opponents to the Warren Court saw this as a liberal package and said this is going too far. The Warren Court is mandating or legislating from the bench a lot of things that we find to be objectionable. Also, many Christian denominations began to react to the social questions raised by the movements of the 1960s and the 1970s. Some denominations, such as the Methodists or the Presbyterians or the Episcopalians, they welcomed the changes and agreed to ordain women for the first time and also adopt a more open or liberal view of human sexuality. Now others, like the Southern Baptists, were more reluctant to accept these changes, and they yearned for a more traditional expression of faith. So many mainline churches like Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Congregationalists, they begin to lose large numbers of adherents to what's called evangelical churches. And by the 1980s, you have 36% of Americans who are describing themselves as born again, which is kind of evangelical language for having accepted Jesus as your Lord and Savior. The theology of the evangelical churches can also be described as fundamentalist. And that means that they take a literal view of the Bible, interpret the Bible literally. They tend to adhere to traditional gender roles, men going to work and women in the home, and They have a strong emphasis on personal morality and personal responsibility, opposing things such as premarital sex and, of course, homosexuality and extramarital sex and things like this. One part of evangelical thinking that I find to be kind of interesting is expressed in what's called millennialism. And millennialism is the belief that's prominent among a lot of Protestants, especially evangelicals, that Jesus' second coming, as perhaps described in the Bible, is imminent. That we're in the last days, and this could happen at any moment. One of the books that gave this movement a lot of momentum was The Late Great Planet Earth, published by Hal Lindsey in 1970. And this promoted the view that the world, the modern world, had become so corrupt, as in the days of Noah, that God is literally about to destroy it. And biblical prophecy is falling into place, and if you just read the signs correctly, then you'll be able to see that we earthlings are definitely in our last days. And then you have this idea called the rapture. The rapture is near, so says Hal Lindsey. Now, not all Christians are aware of the rapture. What that means is that Jesus is going to come back and literally take away all of the faithful believers, whisk them up into heaven, and save them from the time of trial, from the Great Tribulation, in which things are really going to get terrible on earth. And what this does for a lot of believers is it instills this idea that the earth is passing away. It instills this idea that we're on our way out. And so there is a little bit more focus among some evangelicals on the world to come rather than taking care of this one. And one way that we can see this expressed is in, say, environmental policy, right? If this world is about to pass away, why be good stewards of the earth? Because it's about to go. Also, evangelicals took the lead in a major media campaign against worldly evil. The Virginian politician and Baptist Pat Robertson launched the 700 Club. He actually launched it in 1966, and it became very popular in the late 70s and 80s in order to broadcast and promote evangelical values to the country. This inspired the minister Jim Bakker, and there's his wife there to the left, Tammy Faye Bakker, to launch an even more successful show, Praise the Lord Club, which was a little bit like a Christian variety show, having song and dance and speakers and entertainers, but all within this evangelical context, promoting evangelical values. So by the late 1970s, what we begin to see is a coalition of evangelicals and the Republican Party joining together and making common cause. And so the Moral Majority, an official organization, incorporated in 1979 and was headed by a Baptist minister named Jerry Falwell. They opposed, as you can imagine, the Equal Rights Amendment and Roe v. Wade. They sought to maintain the teaching of creationism in public schools in contrast to teaching evolution or some other form of human origins. And they, of course, sought to overturn Engel v. Vital, which outlawed publicly sponsored prayer in schools. Jerry Falwell was very far to the right. He himself said, "If you would like to know where I am politically, I'm to the right of wherever you are. I thought Barry Goldwater was too liberal." Another side of the grassroots revolt against liberalism came in a revolt against taxes. In the 1970s, a retired California businessman named Howard Jarvis began a grassroots movement against tax administration in his home state. Jarvis pointed out that property taxes were not equitably distributed. Small homeowners were often having to pay higher taxes than large property owners or even small business owners, and Jarvis found this to be unfair. Now, the reason behind this is that California had no cap on the property tax hikes. And so as the land on which your property is assessed to be either more valuable or more desirable, the value of that land can raise by up to 50 to 100%. And so when the tax bill comes in, you can find yourself paying almost the entire price of the house again, all in a year. Now, fixed income people, especially people, say older folks on Social Security, they can't deal with this. You cannot deal with the price of your property going so high that you can no longer even pay the taxes. And so Jarvis forms a coalition of what he calls ordinary people. That is, blue-collar workers, teachers, wage earners, and, as he put it, a great number of Negroes. And together they formed the United Organizations of Taxpayers, or UOT. And the major piece of legislation to come out of this group is called Proposition 13. It's a near freeze on property tax increases, which would cap them at 2% a year until the property is resold, and in that case you can reassess the property, and then the new owner has to buy it at the reassessed property tax. So it doesn't affect people on fixed income, or it doesn't affect them that much. So California becomes the battleground for conservative tax reform. Supporters of Proposition 13 framed their argument in stark anti-government populist terms. Jarvis even gained the support of the old left. One union organizer put it, "Those leeches, that is people in government, who must have more and more taxes." And so, Proposition 13 passed overwhelmingly in California in 1978. And that meant that $57 million was removed from the state budget. And so people on fixed incomes had a better shot of keeping their homes, but there was less money for public schools, for police, for fire, and other services. Well, nevertheless, it caught on. Over the next 4 years, 12 states passed similar measures against property tax increases, wanting to cap those rates at manageable amounts so that people on fixed incomes could keep their homes. And this movement, this Proposition 13 movement, which started in California and eventually swept the country, served notice to the Democrats, because even Massachusetts had to cap its property tax increase at 2.5%. Massachusetts being known for being sort of notoriously liberal. And so, as I said, the Democrats are served notice. Beware. Heavy taxation is out. Well, let's turn over to the mass media and look at the television, which also became a battleground for the larger culture wars being fought in the late 1970s and going into the 1980s. So 1970s television pushed issues and often challenged norms. Take, for example, All in the Family, which ran from 1971 up until 1979. It starred the fictional character, played by Carroll O'Connor, Archie Bunker, who represented the blue-collar backlash against liberal and permissive values that he saw on the rise in the 1960s and 70s. And if you even look at his name, it even suggests something about being embattled, right? Bunker. So Archie Bunker, he railed against Hebes, or Jews, Spics, or Italians, and what he called commie crapola, or anything that he thought smacked of liberalism. He treated his wife like a servant, his immigrant son-in-law like a criminal, and he was notoriously suspicious of racial minorities. So Archie Bunker, while he may seem like somebody we just don't like, he's actually something of an anti-hero. He's not entirely likable. Certainly today we would not agree with a lot of his sentiments, but he's also not entirely despicable. He's like your old grandfather who might say some things that you don't agree with, but you also sort of understand where he's coming from. So we understand Archie Bunker because he reflected the clash of old values having to deal with new values. He's sort of an old dog having to learn new tricks. Another show we want to take a look at is The Jeffersons, which aired from 1975 to 1985, making it to this day the longest running show starring black people. Now, The Jeffersons was a spin-off of All in the Family. You see, The Jeffersons were Archie Bunker's black neighbors. And it features a black family who is moving on up, as the theme song says, from Queens to Manhattan because of George's successful dry cleaning business. So they come into money and they immediately move into a big penthouse in the sky. But like Archie Bunker, George has to deal with the realities of the changing world around him. Ironically, even if those changes are for the better. For example, George's old neighbors from Queens come around and make fun of George for getting above himself or for playing something of the Uncle Tom. Oftentimes, the show uses off-color language that we probably would not use today on television, and it was roundly criticized for directly confronting these issues that people really weren't prepared to hear in the 1970s. So the show was often sloppy and occasionally criticized, but nevertheless, it was genuinely funny, and it took an honest look at institutional racism in the United States and tried to address both its realities and its shortcomings. Another show that we want to take a look at is The Mary Tyler Moore Show, which aired from 1970 to 1977, and this is a show that wholly embraced cultural change, especially as it related to women in the workplace. You see, Mary Tyler Moore was an intelligent, never married, independent career woman in the 1970s, which was a rarity in and of itself. At the same time, Moore's character was not aloof to the fact that she inhabited a so-called man's world, and she dealt with this adversity with both dignity and with genuine comic charm. Time magazine said that the show liberated TV for adults of both sexes by being a sophisticated show about grown-ups, among other grown-ups, having grown-up conversations. The Associated Press said the show took 20 years of pointless, insipid situation comedy and spun it on his heels. It did this by pioneering reality comedy and the establishment of clearly defined and motivated secondary characters. So, Mary Tyler Moore is one of these shows that really moves the idea of the situation comedy forward, dealing with not just funny issues, but real issues, issues that definitely intersect with gender and race and real grown-up things that people are talking about. Lastly, let's look at Happy Days. Happy Days is a show that ran from 1974 to 1984, and it was set in the middle of America at the best time ever, or so the show's producers thought, 1950s Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Happy Days, as the name suggests, is a celebration of the past, of a simpler time in which all problems could be resolved in 22 minutes if you include commercials. Happy Days, however, rarely touched on any of the serious issues. Well, that's not true. There was Styx, who was Fonzie's black friend. You see, Styx was a drummer in the boys' band, and the cast then had to deal with an integrated quartet. Well, for whatever reason, the racial problems were very quickly resolved in just 2 episodes, because that's how long Styx lasted, and he was never to be heard from again. So whereas we have Mary Tyler Moore or the Jeffersons or even Archie Bunker that are taking a look at these issues, and we may agree with them, we may not agree with them, we may find them crude, we may find them unnecessarily provocative, well, Happy Days simply wanted to turn the clock back and go back to, well, what they thought of as a simpler time.
And so it's in the late 70s when the California governor Ronald Reagan emerges as a conservative hero. He embodies so much of the conservative forces that we have seen gathering in pop culture, in politics, and media. Ronald Reagan was at first an actor. He starred in 31 Hollywood films. And politically, he identified as a Democrat and said he had voted for Franklin Delano Roosevelt 4 times. But in the 1950s, he decided that the political left was soft on communism. And by 1964, he had converted from an FDR supporter to a Republican for Barry Goldwater. And as governor of California in 1966, he had 2 main themes. One, send the welfare bums back to work, as he said. And by that, he meant anti-war protesters who were, in his view, clogging up the streets, stopping business from running, and messing up our war efforts in Vietnam. And 2, clean up the mess at Berkeley. And by that, he meant the free speech movement, which had taken over the campus and brought light to a lot of issues that, well, the campus administration and the public at large didn't want to talk about. So his governorship in California really set the term for his presidency. And by that, we mean less government, more personal responsibility, and of course, a strong stance against communism. Reagan clearly articulated this vision of the right, small government, personal responsibility in his inaugural address when he said, in this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. Let's highlight that. From time to time, we've been tempted to believe that society has become too complex to be managed by self-rule, that government by an elite group is superior to government for, by, and of the people. Well, no one among us is capable of governing himself, then who among us has the capacity to govern someone else? All of us together, in and out of government, bear the burden. The solutions we seek must be equitable, with no one group singled out to pay a higher price. This is perhaps the thesis statement of Ronald Reagan's presidency. Government is the problem. We have a demographic realignment that takes place around the late 1970s that helps with Ronald Reagan's election. You see, the population that's over 65 is growing. They're growing and they're moving out to the south and they're moving out to the west. And these are the states that tend to be very business friendly. They have the lowest taxes and they have the largest numbers of retirees and a growing number of evangelical Christians. And so this hostility toward what they feel of as big government or the liberal agenda was deeply rooted, as were traditional values about sexuality and gender roles. So, in other words, a pro-Reagan conservative coalition begins to emerge in both the South and the West. And you can have a look at the election of 1980, in which Ronald Reagan pretty much takes the entire country, save for a few states. You've got Georgia down there. That's where Carter's from. That's it for the most part. So as president, Reagan has a couple of really big goals: lower the taxes, reduce the size of the federal government, increase the size of the military, and that serves the end of defeating the Soviet Union. So on his first goal, to lower taxes, he inherits a mess. Inflation in the 70s was at 13% a year and growing, and unemployment is at a staggering 7.5%. Reagan's simple message is, of course, government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem. And he looks to the 1920s Secretary of the Treasury named Andrew Mellon for answers. And he says, look, it's time to reawaken the industrial giant, to get government back within its means, and to lighten the punitive tax burden. So Andrew Mellon's plan back in the 1920s was to reduce taxes and ease regulation on businesses. He believed that what this would actually do is put more money in people's pockets, allowing them to buy, to sell, to invest, therefore the rising tide lifting all boats, and that will actually increase the amount of money that is gained by the federal government in tax revenue. So by reducing taxes, easing regulation, allow people to control more and more of their money, the US government will actually benefit. And so following this model, in 1981, Reagan signed the Economic Recovery Act. What this does is it slashes taxes drastically by 25% and lowered the maximum rate from 70 to 28%. Capital gains drop from 40 to 28%. Capital gains is the income that one receives through investments. He termed this supply side economics or Reaganomics. You cut the taxes at the top and you hope it will trickle down to those of us at the bottom. So because of the bulk of the tax cuts, though, are going to go to the wealthiest Americans, it's called trickle down economics. Like I've said, cut it at the top. The top will buy, sell, invest, and employ, and the rest of us down at the bottom will benefit from the greater wealth flowing downward. And so the idea is a rising tide will lift all boats. So will a rising tide lift all boats? So to this end, Reagan signed the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. And this slashes $35 billion on government social programs because Reagan hoped to balance the budget. And so, in effect, this is going to reduce federal funding for school lunches, public housing, food stamps, public libraries, and other social and so-called entitlement programs. Now, in reality, these cuts were $35 million less than Carter had wanted to spend. So just a little bit of a cautionary tale here as we proceed. Do not rush to judgment on the Republicans. Democrats and Republicans are sometimes known for doing the same things. We simply emphasize different aspects of their actions depending on our predisposition. Well, the liberals nevertheless cried foul. The Democratic Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, says the president has no concern, no regard, no care for the little man in America. And President Reagan quipped back by saying that the social programs were for the truly needy. Well, even after the tax cuts went into effect, evidence emerged to suggest that widespread prosperity was not returning to America. Unemployment, inflation, and despair that characterized the Carter era were still very much a problem. And so Reagan decided to reverse course. He signed the Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Act of 1982. This included $98 billion in tax increases that he did not pile on to the ordinary taxpayer per se, but rather called revenue enhancements and disguised them elsewhere within the budget. Well, the economy then, either because of this tax plan or not, and economists are, of course, debating, began to take a strong upturn. And this economic upturn lasted through both of Reagan's 2 terms as president. Inflation dropped to 4.3%, unemployment fell, and the stock market roared back to life. 14.5 million new jobs were added to the economy. And so, did Reaganomics work? And by that, you have to define what we mean by work. And I suppose the answer is kind of. The top 1% of income earners made huge gains in the 1980s. If you look at the chart to the right, you'll see the red line is really skyrocketing. Everyone else kind of stagnated. Modest gains here, a little bit of a fallback, and well, the top 1% is really the folks you want to keep your eye on. So the general consensus on Reaganomics is supply side economics did not, in fact, cause a trickle down, but rather it caused a concentration of wealth at the top, within the top 1%. In 1976, for example, the top 1% owned 8.9% of all wealth in America. By 1990, the top 1% owned 37% of all the wealth in America. And that's the general consensus of economists on Reaganomics, is that no, it did not cause widespread distribution of wealth. It caused concentration of wealth at the top. The top bracket's earnings were 40 times that of the bottom. So did supply side economics work? The answer is yeah, for some people. Well, in 1981, Ronald Reagan confronts one of the first big domestic problems of his presidency. The Air Traffic Controllers Union, otherwise known as PATCO, gave the liberals a rallying cause. Liberals have historically depended on organized labor as a voting base. And so PATCO went on strike against what they felt were dangerous and debilitating working conditions. They also wanted a raise and a 32-hour work week. The problem is that federal employees, and that's what the folks who work for PATCO are prohibited from striking by federal law. And so under the Taft-Hartley Act, which is a rather old act passed back in 1947 under the presidency of Harry Truman, Reagan fired all of them. That's 11,345,000 people without even so much as addressing any of their concerns. He framed it like this. He says, there is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, at any time. And that's how he framed it, as a matter of public safety. And so in doing so, Reagan sent a clear message to the left. He says, I'm on the side of business, not labor. Historians also discern a message to the Soviet Union, which of course is watching Reagan's every step, and that is, I don't compromise with bullies. Reagan also took a strong stand on environmental problems, and the stand that he took is, we don't have environmental problems. Many conservatives from the 60s, 70s forward have dismissed warnings about global warming, today we would say climate change, as a strategy to regulate business, and Ronald Reagan very much agreed. Carter had created the National Climate Program Office, and Reagan slashed the budget so much as to make it irrelevant, even non-existent. The Environmental Protection Agency, which was created under Richard Nixon, filed no new enforcement cases against hazardous waste, but 18,000 cases were lingering from the Carter years. Reagan also tabled talk on securing safe working environments. He slashed the budget of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, also known as OSHA. And this virtually ended new attempts to regulate potentially toxic work environments. Reagan appointed James Watt as the Secretary of the Interior. Now, the function of the Secretary of the Interior is to manage and sustain America's lands, water, wildlife, and energy resources. And so the Interior Secretary is supposed to be something of an environmentalist or at least a conservationist. Now, the problem with Watt is that he is nowhere near a friend to the environment. Watt advocates the sale and development of federally protected lands for ranching and foresting. So he recommends their development and commoditization, not preservation. In fact, Watt has this really long history of fighting environmental regulations. He was a self-proclaimed sagebrush rebel, and that's somebody who believes that public lands, including the natural resources that are deposited on those public lands, are a violation of states' rights if one is to actually protect them. He actually has a pretty interesting quote that he uses. He says, "I don't use the word Democrats and Republicans, liberals and Americans." So about this economic growth, did it benefit everybody? Well, as we had said, the effects were experienced unevenly. Of the 14.5 new jobs, 3 million of them were concentrated in unskilled, minimum wage industries. And of the high paying jobs in financial services or real estate or insurance or law, 70% of them went to white men, 2% went to black men or to women. And so the 1980s saw modest increases for women who worked outside of the home. From 1960 to 1983, the percentage of women lawyers, for example, rose from 2 to 15%. The percent of jobs in banking and financial management held by women had risen from 9 to 39%. And so gender roles within the 1980s began to blur just a little bit. So even as we think of the 1980s as this really conservative time, we have to remind ourselves that they're not immune to the cultural demands of the 1960s when it comes to things such as gender. And when we look at 1985, we see that 1/2 of college graduates were women. They earned a rising share of all advanced degrees, including 1/3 of the degrees in law, business, accounting, and computer and information sciences. Interestingly, one survey said that 21% of white married men said they would prefer to stay at home and take care of their children if they could. I found this to be a very interesting, even startling statistic. And in the 1980s, pop culture reflected some of these changes. For example, there was Mr. Mom. That's 1983, and it's starring Michael Keaton and Terry Garr. And it's about a regular guy who works in the auto industry and is laid off and has to deal with the fact that his wife is going to go to work in advertising, and she rises to executive level very quickly, ends up making a lot of money, leaving him at home to take care of the kids. And you can see by the photo there that he's not terribly happy about it. But nevertheless, he comes to accept his calling and deals with it with grace and dignity in the end. There's also Baby Boom from 1987, starring Diane Keaton, about a career-driven executive woman who has to respond to the calls of motherhood and how are we going to balance both. And so you've got these things reflected in popular culture in the 1980s. The 1980s also came with a renewed emphasis on material wealth and financial success. Even if the 1% saw most of the gains, the lure of riches was the talk of the day for a lot of people in the 1980s. CBS launched a TV show in response to this called Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, starring Robin Leach, in which the host sort of roved around and surveyed various homes and estates of rich people and allowed us to look inside, admire them, and even envy them. TV even held out the promise that riches just might happen. In other words, it could happen to you. For example, there was Silver Spoons, which ran from 1982 to 1986. It was about a young boy who moved in with a wealthy dad he had never met. This all of a sudden rags to riches story. Then there was Different Strokes, which started in 1978 and ran all the way till 1986. This is about two black youths from Harlem who were unexpectedly adopted by a wealthy Park Avenue businessman, and that's where they live out the rest of their days. So there's this suggestion in the 1980s that sudden wealth could just happen. And I've been wondering about that. And I'm thinking, maybe is this a response to the fact that really the 1% were the only ones who got a whole lot of material gains? And so this is a way of justifying it. People saying, well, it's all just luck anyway, or I don't know. Whatever the case, the mass media approach the newfound obsession with wealth in various ways. You have Family Ties, starring Michael J. Fox, which ran from 1982 to 1989. And it features a young Reagan Republican. You can see him there on the left. He's wearing his tie, and he walks around oftentimes in this suit and tie, sort of aloof to everything that's going around him, because he has to live with his liberal ex-hippie parents. So there's this generational clash. The old liberal values versus the new up and coming money values, and he's a likable character nonetheless. But this is a way of sort of dealing with this on stage or on television. Michael J. Fox was such a success in his role as Alex P. Keaton on Family Ties that he went on to reprise the same role, sort of. It's not the same character, but he's more or less the same guy, in 1987's The Secret of My Success, in which a Kansas kid wins big in the Big Apple, and he does it through honesty, pluck, and hard work. And this seems to be the message behind The Secret of My Success, is that wealth is available to you, but you've got to be an honest guy, a good guy, right? Other shows are a little bit more cynical, such as Wall Street, also from 1987. And here you have Michael Douglas giving his famous speech at the end called now Greed is Good, in which success is apparently the result of ruthless, cutthroat competition, and the good guys don't always win. Then there was my favorite show from the 1980s, Miami Vice. Now, this one I thought was really cool because it revolutionized how we look at television. It combines the idea of the cop drama, which was very popular in the 1980s, Hill Street Blues, shows like that, with MTV, which was starting to show music videos for the first time in 1981. And it gives us this multimedia hour of drama and music and action, and it was really dramatic. The storyline follows two undercover cops who are so immersed in a world of wealth and corruption that they sometimes forget who they are. And so, yeah, there's these cars, boats, gunfights, lots of action. But at the heart of the show are these two ordinary guys that are trying to stay honest in a world of, well, vice. As with Wall Street, we see that sometimes wealth and power is enough to overcome honesty and goodness. And the good guys, they don't always win. Well, Ronald Reagan and a lot of folks in his administration were a lot less revolutionary when it came to social issues. Homelessness was one of the most visible signs of the 1980s. The percentage of homeless people doubled during the Reagan era. 15% of Americans lived below the poverty line, although one half lived in households in which at least one person worked. And of particular concern was the fact that many of the homeless were veterans. Why? Why do we see homelessness on the rise during the 1980s? Well, on the one hand, we can look to the income gap. The top 1% claimed a larger proportion of the wealth, leaving less to split with the other 99%. Also, the nation was in the process of what we call deindustrializing, or sending manufacturing jobs overseas. Today we have a name for it. We call it outsourcing. But at the time, it wasn't entirely clear what was going to be happening to the economy as a result. And so these good, sometimes union jobs, Reagan didn't much care for unions, they're being sent by other people overseas who will do them cheaper. So most of the new jobs that were created during the 1980s were either high paying executive positions requiring college degrees, or there were service jobs that were minimum wage. So at the same time, we see that the government all but abandoned its commitment to public housing and urban renewal and starts focusing more on military spending. Another major concern of the 1980s was the rise in illegal drug use. The drug use has always been around in some form. The 1960s gave it a boost with people like Timothy Leary selling LSD as a way to expand your mind. Nancy Reagan, who was the president's wife, she's the first lady, took on as one of her causes the Just Say No campaign of the 1980s, trying to get kids off of drugs. It involved a huge media campaign to keep kids and anybody away from illegal narcotics. And some of these ads were a little bit goofy and meant for the youngest of audiences. And then some really made a serious attempt to scare you. And I remember this one where somebody brings out an egg in a pan and says, "This is your brain." And then he fries the egg and says, "This is your brain on drugs." And so drugs became the hot issue of the 1980s. In 1980, just 3 to 4% of Americans thought that drugs were a quote serious problem. By the time you get to 1989, 64% of Americans believe that drugs were the most important problem. So, in a span of just under a decade, they go from, yeah, okay, it's something that's an issue, to it's the most important problem we are facing. And so the federal government made a serious attempt to wage a war on drugs. This is a renewed war on drugs. The war on drugs actually started under Nixon, and then in the Reagan era, we stepped it up again. So what this means is that a lot of money is going to flow into state and local law enforcement, and the those police forces are going to be militarized. They're going to become equipped with a lot more heavy artillery, and they're going to be able to do a lot more surveillance and drug enforcement. They're going to start to look like these little armies patrolling the streets. Um, Another thing you're going to see is mandatory sentencing laws are going to be established. Penalties are going to be strengthened, making the law tougher and tougher and tougher on people who are caught using or selling illegal drugs. And it's bipartisan. Republicans competed with Democrats to see who could be tougher on drug crimes. And because of this, of course, incarceration rates skyrocketed. More and more people are going to be going to jail. So one of the consequences of the war on drugs is that the number of people that we have behind bars increases by about fivefold. And you can see there on the graph between 1980 and 1990, this is where we see the largest spike in the number of people that we are putting behind bars because of drug-related crimes. Sometimes these crimes are nonviolent. It's simply having them or selling them or whatever it is you're doing with them. So as you can imagine, mass incarceration multiplies other social problems. If you have a drug conviction and you have a criminal record, that means you're going to have trouble applying for a job. Nobody's going to want a felon around. You're going to have trouble getting a business loan because nobody's going to want to extend any money to somebody who has been known to traffic or use drugs. You're going to have trouble getting a student loan to go back to school because nobody's going to want to have to do this. You have to disclose these things, which means that you can't, clean up your life, so to speak, and go back to college. You also cannot rent an apartment because sometimes people will not rent to folks that have felony convictions or something like this. And so this war on drugs is also creating not only this group of people that are incarcerated, but when they're released from these prisons, from these jails, then they have a very hard time fitting into society. Another thing you can't do is you cannot change the system because if you have a drug conviction, you're denied the vote and you're denied even the opportunity to sit on a jury. So civic participation is also withheld from people who have drug convictions. And this is forever, okay? You don't erase this. Once you have a drug conviction, it's on there for life. And so it's fair to us to ask, who is selling and using drugs and who is going to jail? Well, if you take a look at the statistics, drug users, and on the other side, those people who are incarcerated for drugs, the drug users are 72% white and 13% black and 15% other. Now, on the other side, who's going to jail for drug-related crimes? 60% of those incarcerated are black, 25% are white, and you've still got that 15% other. So there seems to be a real disparity between who's actually using or selling or however you might handle these things, trafficking in them, and who is paying the price for the drug war. One of the curious distinctions that's made in the 1980s is between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. Now, here's sort of the difference. You can read the chart on the side there, which comes from drugrehab.org. But cocaine is a powder. It's a drug. It's expensive. It's addictive. It's harmful to your body. We don't want to use it. Crack is also cocaine, but it's cocaine that you can smoke. It's cheaper and it's said to be more addictive. Cocaine use was and is more prevalent among whites, especially upper class whites who have the money to buy it. Crack is associated with Black people, and it first emerged in the inner cities. And so here we have this distinction, which is not a clear distinction. One is a powder, one you can smoke. One is more addictive, one is less addictive. But here's what happens in the sentencing of people who are found with either one. 5 grams of crack will get you the same sentence as 500 grams of cocaine. That's for a 5-year prison sentence. So the person walking around with 500 grams of powder cocaine, that's going to land him or her the same sentence as someone with 5 grams of crack cocaine. And these drugs are, for the most part, the same drug. Another problem. The 1980s saw the emergence of one of the deadliest, most feared, and most politicized diseases of the 20th century, and that would be called AIDS. AIDS stands for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, and it's caused by the human immunodeficiency virus, otherwise known as HIV. And so when one is infected with HIV, that virus could stay within their body for a number of years before it becomes active and causes the constellation of problems that we call AIDS. Well, AIDS came into the public view in the 1980s. Health officials started to report that homosexual men and intravenous drug users were developing this strange constellation of symptoms, whether or not be respiratory problems or skin lesions or whatever. There was a number of problems that seemed to be associated with gay men in the 1980s. Their ability to combat infection was what was drastically compromised. So an ordinary infection that would, if a healthy person gets the flu or a cold or something like that, their immune system would fight it off and they would get better. But with a person with AIDS, their immune system is unable to respond to that immune system, to that infection, and that's what causes them to get sick and eventually die. And it was called for a while there gay cancer or gay plague because it seemed to appear only or almost exclusively among homosexual men. So the Reagan administration was very slow to respond because of the association of AIDS with homosexuality. Pat Buchanan, who was Reagan's director of communications, said that homosexuals have declared war on nature. And now nature is exacting an awful retribution. Reagan said of homosexuals on the campaign trail, my criticism of the gay movement isn't just asking for civil rights, it's asking for recognition and acceptance of an alternative lifestyle, which I do not believe society can condone, nor can I. And as president then, Reagan was mainly silent about the AIDS crisis. A lot of critics had to rethink their views on AIDS when Ryan White gained public attention. Ryan White was a teenager from Kokomo, Indiana. He was also a hemophiliac, which means he had a problem in his blood. His blood does not clot like normal people's blood clots, and so he had to have frequent blood transfusions when he was a kid. And that's how he acquired HIV, through a blood transfusion, not through these other means. And so he was diagnosed with AIDS in 1984. Ryan White was not quiet about having AIDS, nor was he quiet about speaking out on behalf of people with AIDS. And he proved to many people that AIDS was not just a gay issue, that it was not confined to a subset of people, that anybody could get it, anybody could be infected, and it's not a disease with an agenda. He says, I was labeled a troublemaker, my mom an unfit mother, and I was not welcome anywhere. And the big battle for Ryan White during his lifetime was to win the right to go to school with his peers. And he had to constantly face criticism that somehow this disease would be spread through ordinary contact, through a hug, through a kiss, through sharing a glass, something like that, sharing a toilet seat. Many people worried about. And of course, none of this turned out to be true. AIDS is only spread through very intimate contact, sharing bodily fluids. Well, Ryan White died in 1990, and Congress after that was very responsive and established the Ryan White Conference on HIV and Care Treatment. And as you can see, it's still going on. When it came to the Cold War and the Soviet Union, Presidents Nixon and Carter had approached the Soviet Union very much through the spirit of détente. Détente means literally a reduction in tension between the two superpowers. It could mean arms reduction, cooperation, mutual understanding, the belief that the USSR and the USA could coexist peacefully. And so through the spirit of détente, the USA and the USSR had reached several important arms treaties known as the SALT treaties. Ronald Reagan was not interested in détente. He was a Cold Warrior of another era. He had a mindset of an earlier period. The USSR in his mind was entirely bad. The Soviet Union underlies all unrest in the world, he said in 1980, and he meant all. At another point, he called the Soviet Union the evil empire that must be destroyed. He did not see a future in which both the USA and the Soviet Union could occupy the same globe. Détente was a one-way street, he said, favoring the Soviets. And so his goal was not to de-escalate the Cold War, but to win the Cold War. And so Reagan embarked on a military buildup unprecedented in previous administrations. And you can see by the graph on the left there, Reagan's Cold War push was second only to the Korean War when it came to buildup. It called for more resources than Vietnam. He devoted $1.6 trillion to the defense budget. Now, Carter had planned for $1.2 trillion. He combined with his tax cuts, though, this meant large deficits. Reagan was also betting that the U.S. economy could better handle the debt than that of the Soviet economy. He wanted to win a nuclear conflict if possible. And he also hoped, and some people say this was his primary goal, to bankrupt the Soviet Union. So you can see here, in contrast to other presidents, Ronald Reagan increased the national debt more than anyone, including some of the Republicans over there. George H.W. Bush, who also slashed taxes while building the military, but he did not approach the levels of Ronald Reagan. So the military buildup worried a lot of people. Could a nuclear war be really won by anyone? 1982, you have a Yale professor named Jonathan Schnell who says no, and he publishes The Fate of the Earth, claiming that environmental damage from a nuclear war would be so great that the Earth would not be inhabitable anymore. 1983, ABC released a made-for-TV movie called The Day After, which frightened the public immensely about living in a world, a post-nuclear apocalyptic world in which nothing grows, everything is radioactive and mutated, and it was really, really, really scary, and it scared a lot of people into rethinking their commitment to the Cold War. And so anti-nuclear movements began in earnest, and by 1980, the Roman Catholic Church formally rejected nuclear weapons as a legitimate instrument of war. But Reagan was sort of tone deaf to a lot of these cries and essentially gave the Pentagon a blank check. In other words, spend whatever you want, Reagan told the nation. This is important. He said deterrence simply means this: making sure any adversary who thinks about attacking the United States or our allies or our vital interests concludes that the risk to him outweigh any potential gains. Once he understands that, he won't attack. We maintain peace through strength. Weakness only invites aggression. Let me say that last part again. Peace through strength. Weakness only invites aggression. And that is what characterizes Ronald Reagan's approach to foreign policy. Peace through strength. Reagan, as we said, is undeterred. He believes in the motto, peace through strength. And in 1983, he revealed his most controversial defense program, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was popularly known as Star Wars. The idea behind Star Wars was to put lasers in space that would intercept and destroy Soviet missiles in flight if they were launched from the other side of the globe. It was the most expensive system ever devised, raising the debt by another 2 trillion. And we're not sure if it's even, well, possible. Scientists even doubted that the existing technology could even do this job. And so the SDI initiative was dubbed science fiction. And Reagan took a lot of heat in the press for wanting to sort of invent something that we're not sure could ever exist. But here was the other side of Reagan's plan. The Soviet Union was forced to answer SDI, and in doing so, it had to spend more to keep up than it had. Who will win this expansive and expensive sci-fi arms race? Ronald Reagan said it will break the Soviets first, and he was betting on that. Well, interestingly, Reagan's foremost international concern was Central America, and this is also connected to his fear of the Soviet war and the spread of communism. You see, there in Central America, he detected the most serious communist threat. So under Reagan, the US sent aid to El Salvador, which was involved in a civil war between communists and right-wing militants. And so the plot thickens if we look over to another Central American country, Nicaragua. The State Department said that Cuban-sponsored Sandinista government, which was a socialist left-wing government, was sending Soviet and Cuban arms to the communists in El Salvador. So the bad guys, according to Reagan, are sending arms to other bad guys in El Salvador. And so in response then, Reagan orders the CIA to train and equip the anti-communist Nicaraguans who are called the Contras, or counter-revolutionaries. So the Soviet Union is supposedly supplying the bad guys, and the USA is going to supply the good guys. And that's how Reagan sees this. By 1984, Reagan had restored strength and vitality and prestige to the White House. The press spoke openly of a Reagan revolution, which had transformed America. And so for the 1984 election, the Reagan campaign had a brilliant slogan. It's morning again in America. This ad, which went all over the country, highlighted economic growth, halting in the fact that they had halted inflation and a return to traditional values. The campaign credited the Reagan administration with essentially solving the problems of the 1970s and creating a much better, much more stronger, more powerful America. And a lot of Americans really agreed. Because by contrast, the Democrats could only offer Walter Mondale as candidate. This was a bad decision on the part of the Democrats, I think, because this was Jimmy Carter's vice president. And as Jimmy Carter's vice president, he was associated with that administration, which is not known for its domestic successes. Not that Jimmy Carter was bad or he was unsuccessful in all ways, but in the public mind, no, this is not somebody that we really want back. He was also endorsed by the AFL-CIO, and that's the biggest labor union in the United States. He was endorsed by NOW, the National Organization for Women. He was endorsed by many prominent African American groups. And so he was seen as representative of narrow, liberal, special interest groups. Well, nevertheless, Walter Mondale did shatter one important glass ceiling. He chose as his running mate for vice president Geraldine Ferraro, the first woman chosen on a major party ticket. Unfortunately for Geraldine Ferraro, she had to answer more questions about her husband's suspicious business dealings than her public policy positions. And anyway, Mondale turned out to be a very poor candidate, and perhaps this is because, well, too honest. What do I mean by that? Too honest? Well, when asked about his tax policy, he said this: Mr. Reagan will raise your taxes, and so will I. He won't tell you that, but I just did. Okay. Very rarely do politicians get elected who promise they're going to raise your taxes. I remember sitting in the living room with my dad at this time who said, well, we don't have to worry about Walter Mondale now. And, well, for better or for worse, he was right. So there we have the election of 1984, in which Ronald Reagan takes every state except for Minnesota and the District of Columbia, and an astounding 59% of the popular vote. The Reagan Revolution was here to stay. And so Reagan enters his second term, buoyed by this victory in 1984. He called it a second American Revolution of hope and opportunity. He taunted the congressional Democrats who had threatened to raise taxes, and he said to them, go ahead, make my day. He's Dirty Harry now. And then he set to work on the Tax Reform Act of 1986. That is, he set to work on it right away, and it finally got passed in 1986. Now, this one was the most far reaching tax reform package the country had yet seen since 1913 when we first got the IRS. It reduced the tax brackets from 14 to 2. It lowered the maximum rates that you would pay from 50 to 28% and raised the lower bracket from 11 to 15%. The corporate tax rate dropped from 50 to 35%. This is the biggest overhaul since the IRS was established by Woodrow Wilson in 1913. Also on the world stage, a new menace began to appear: Islamist terrorists. In 1983, suicide terrorists bombed the U.S. Embassy in Beirut. Also in 1983, terrorists attacked the U.S. Embassy in Kuwait. In 1984, Iranian terrorists took Americans hostage. In 1985, terrorists began to hijack commercial airlines and hold the prisoners hostage. What did they want? They usually wanted something like the release of their partners, their co-terrorists, U.S. concessions in Israel, or sometimes payment in arms or something else. Now, Reagan has a very clear response to these terrorists. We do not negotiate with terrorists. This is Reagan policy. Don't try to hijack us. Don't try to take us hostages. You're not going to get any concessions out of us. In 1985, the Reagan administration found itself mired in scandal and in conflict with itself. Now you remember, I'm going to bring this up again, the support Reagan wanted to give the anti-communist Contras in Nicaragua. These are people fighting communism in Central America. Well, they're not exactly nice guys. They use tactics that are kind of, bullying, and they're not exactly, they don't exactly respect other people's civil rights and things like that. And so Congress forbid further support to the Contras. No more arms, no communists, no supplies, no support. I don't care if they are anti-communist, they're still bad guys. Now, at the same time, terrorists who are backed by Iran held American hostages in Lebanon. Now, remember, the US does not negotiate with terrorists. So how are we going to get out of this problem? And now Reagan makes it clear that he wants to find a way to free the hostages in Lebanon. And again, I remind you, the Reagan administration wants to give support to the anti-communist Contras in Nicaragua, but Congress had forbid it. So his advisors say this: why don't we sell a few U.S.-grade weapons to the moderate factions in Iran? This may do the trick. If we engage in a deal with Iran, perhaps they will use their influences to free up some of the hostages in Lebanon. And so, in pursuit of this goal, the U.S. sent 4 secret shipments of weapons to Iran over the next year, and 1 hostage was released. It was Lieutenant Oliver North who hit on a scandalous solution. The U.S. will illegally sell weapons to Iran, thereby telling the Congress to, where it can stick it. We're going to go ahead and fund these anti-communist people. And in doing so, Iran will likely free the American hostages. The money can be used to fund the Contras, and Congress never has to know. And here's the big question, too. What did Reagan know? In 1986, just a year later, a Lebanese newspaper revealed that the US had been illegally trading with Iran. The Iran-Contra scandal, also known as Irangate, soon hit the American press. Admiral Poindexter admitted to the guilt, but said that he never informed the president. The president knew nothing about it. He said, "I did this so I could insulate him from the decision and provide him some future deniability for the president if it ever leaked out." In other words, I was protecting the president. I was doing these illegal things, but I didn't tell him so that he could deny it. And the question remains, what did Reagan know? We'll never know what Reagan said because he responded by saying, "I don't know. I don't remember. I don't know," under oath. And so, to what extent is this true? People still wonder. He did come clean a few months later and said to the American people on television, "A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that is true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not." Ronald Reagan is sometimes remembered as the Teflon president, the president that no scandal could touch. But we have to remember that he was not terribly popular until the economy began to improve in 1983. His approval rating sank after taking office down to 39%. And as we know, a president's popularity rises with economic growth. And so after the Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Act of 1982, we see his popularity rise to 57% in 1984, reminding us again, as James Carville will say in the 1992 election, it's the economy, stupid. Well, the Iran-Contra or Irangate saw his took a hit to his popularity. We see him drop to about 45%, but then we see a rise in the president's popularity. What's causing this? The president's rising popularity was largely due to a spectacularly improved relationship with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had been involved in economic stagnation, internal corruption, and increased pressure from Reagan's Cold War. The Soviet Union dealing with all of these things in the 1980s. But in 1985, Soviet leadership appointed a new premier, and his name was Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev is not Soviet old guard. He is interested in promoting change and accommodation with the West. He wants to pursue more of a policy of détente, and he's going to reach out to Ronald Reagan personally. His first new policy, that is Mikhail Gorbachev's first new policy, is called perestroika. It means restructuring. And what he wants to do is he wants to modernize the Soviet economy by adding elements of market economics to communism, allowing for a certain measure of private ownership and buying and selling. And the government is not going to bail out failing businesses. We're going to allow the free market to decide what businesses will prevail in our economy. The second policy is called glasnost or openness, and this is more of a social reform. It's to permit greater democratic freedom and openness about the workings of government, allowing people a measure of criticism and commentary on what their government is doing, which is not how the old Soviet Guard did things under, say, the totalitarian system of Stalin or Brezhnev or something like that. And so what we see is a new day is dawning for the Soviet Union, and indeed a new day is dawning for the relationship between the USA and its chief rival, the Soviet Union. Reagan and Gorbachev agree to meet in a series of historic summits or meetings. The first is called the Geneva Conference, happening in Geneva in November of 1985. Here, Gorbachev puts his intentions on the table and offers to disarm all INF missiles aimed at Western Europe. Reagan is taken by surprise. He's very suspicious of this and is unwilling to make concessions. Still not sure what Gorbachev is up to. Reagan did say, though, that the United States and the Soviet Union are the two greatest countries on Earth, the superpowers. They are the only ones who could start World War III, but also the only two countries that can bring peace to the world. So they do not reach any substantive agreements here in Geneva, but they agree to meet again in a year. Conference number 2 takes place in Reykjavik, which is in December of 1986. Here, Gorbachev expands his offer. He's going to eliminate all ballistic missiles, and the US will stop research into the SDI program, Star Wars. This is his suggestion to Reagan. Now, Reagan says no on this. He doesn't want to give up Star Wars. He sees how expensive it is, and he sees that Gorbachev is trying to get the US to back away from this really expensive project that he cannot keep pace with. And so then Gorbachev makes another stunning proposal. He says, how about this? The elimination of, well, all nuclear weapons. Wow, okay. Is this too good to be true? Once again, Reagan is very suspicious of this. He believes that Gorbachev is a man of goodwill, but he does not want to completely disarm the United States. So the talks break down at the very last minute, but as before, they agree to meet again. Now, in the interim, Reagan gave a speech at Brandenburg Gate in Germany in 1987, and this is in front of the Berlin Wall, which is that symbol of oppression and symbol of the divide between the East and the West. It was constructed by Premier Khrushchev in 1961. And here he issues a direct challenge to Gorbachev, saying, we welcome change and openness, for we believe that freedom and security go together, that the advance of human liberty can only strengthen the cause of world peace. There is one sign that the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Once again, we can look to pop culture to see some of the optimistic spirit of the day. In 1986, a television show came out called Perfect Strangers. Now, this was not about Russia or the Cold War, at least not directly. What it was about was two long-lost relatives named Larry and Balki, who end up becoming roommates in New York City. Now, Balki is from a fictional Greek island. It's not real, and to try to find it is silly. But his accent is strangely Russian, and his rural background suggests the Soviet bloc. He is enamored with American materialism, American culture, and with American people. And the show's title, Perfect Strangers, even recalls a quote from the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky. He says, we sometimes encounter people, perfect strangers, who begin to interest us at first sight, somehow suddenly, all at once, before a word has been spoken. And so seeing this television show in the midst of Glasnost, in the midst of the historic arms reduction summits, we can see that pop culture is responding to this, and pop culture is hopeful for a spirit of renewal and reconciliation. Even more direct, however, is the blockbuster movie Rocky IV, which was released also in 1986. Now, if we know something about the Rocky mythology, it's about a street fighter gone prize fighter. Rocky Balboa, the all-American prize fighter, must face the Soviet Ivan Drago, who is a scientifically enhanced Russian experiment in athletics. He's all drugged up. He's practically a machine. You know, it's one of these things. The Russians can't play fair in this movie. Rocky trains by eating raw eggs and running in mountains, and Drago takes a lot of drugs and relies on computers to pump him up. And so it shows this technological war between the Soviets and the Americans. The Americans are being represented as truly human, and Soviets are just machines, right? We can see the symbolism. Well, after this interminable battle between the boxers, Rocky not only defeats his opponent, but begins to win over the Russian people. And he takes the microphone and says to what was a very hostile crowd, during this fight, I've seen a lot of changing in the way you feel about me and the way I feel about you. In here, there were two guys killing each other, but I guess that's better than 20 million. I guess what I'm trying to say is that if I can change, and if you can change, everybody can change. Well, if Ivan Drago and Rocky Balboa can change, then perhaps the Soviet Union and the USA can change. And so at the third of these major conference agreements, the Washington Summit held in December of 1987, they meet again. Now, during the summit, Reagan is dealing with the Iran-Contra scandal, and the eyes of the world are upon him, and people are seeing him as perhaps a shady character, someone who cannot be trusted. He's even taking criticism from people like William H. Buckley and Richard Nixon. How about that? Richard Nixon calling someone out on a scandal. Well, that's another story. Well, nevertheless, a treaty agreement is reached. It's called the INF Treaty. It requires that the US and the USSR eliminate forever all nuclear and conventional missiles with a range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers. Now, although this is just 4% of the total arsenal, it is a very significant 4%. And so we've reached a period in US history where Ronald Reagan, the man who called the Soviet Union the evil empire and set out to destroy it, actually comes to the most significant compromise within the Cold War. And this is going to lead to the dismantling of the Soviet Union.